I lived like I had more time. Not consciously. Not arrogantly. Just, implicitly. 10 seconds into this confession, here is the truth I avoided for most of my life: I didn't waste my time doing nothing. I wasted it believing there would always be more. I never felt rushed. I never felt desperate. I believed time was patient, elastic, forgiving. That if something didn't happen now, it would happen later. If I missed a moment, another would replace it. If I delayed a choice, it would wait for me. That belief shaped everything. I postponed conversations that felt uncomfortable. Delayed decisions that felt heavy. Ignored impulses that felt inconvenient. I told myself I was being thoughtful, measured, mature. In reality, I was assuming tomorrow was guaranteed. I didn't chase urgency. Urgency felt reckless. I admired people who lived intensely, but I kept my distance from them. They seemed dramatic, unstable, too emotional. I preferred calm. Control. A life that moved steadily instead of burning brightly. I told myself intensity was optional. Time proved otherwise. I remember how often I said things like, one day, and, eventually, and, there's no rush. Those phrases sounded harmless. Responsible, even. No one ever challenged them. Why would they? Time doesn't object when you misuse it. It just keeps going. I lived in a constant state of later. Later I would try harder. Later I would be braver. Later I would change what felt wrong. I treated the present like a waiting room instead of a place where life was actually happening. And the strangest part? Nothing stopped me. There was no catastrophe to wake me up. No deadline that forced clarity. Life remained functional enough to justify delay. That's the danger: when nothing collapses, you assume everything is fine. Years passed quietly that way. I marked time by obligations, not experiences. Birthdays felt symbolic rather than personal. Seasons blurred together. I had memories, but very few that felt sharp enough to define me. I didn't feel old. I felt paused. I told myself I was pacing myself. That there was no reason to rush into things that would eventually come naturally. Relationships, purpose, meaning, those would arrive when the timing was right. I trusted time more than I trusted myself. I see now how subtle that surrender was. Every time I chose comfort over honesty, I told myself I'd fix it later. Every time I stayed silent instead of saying what mattered, I assumed there would be another chance. Every time I stayed in situations that felt misaligned, I convinced myself I was just being patient. Patience can be a virtue. But it can also be a disguise. I began to notice something unsettling in my 30s, not panic, not crisis, just a quiet pressure. A sense that moments were passing without leaving a mark. That life was moving forward, but I wasn't accumulating meaning along the way. I had plans. I didn't have momentum. I watched people around me change. They made choices that altered their lives permanently. Some failed. Some succeeded. All of them seemed shaped by what they had lived through. I remained largely the same. Adaptable. Reasonable. Untouched. That should have felt safe. Instead, it felt eerie. Like watching life through glass. Late at night, alone, I sometimes tried to remember the last time I had done something knowing it might not work. Knowing it might hurt. Knowing it might cost me something real. I struggled to find an answer. Because risk had always felt optional, something I could engage with later, when time felt tighter. The idea that time might already be tight hadn't fully formed yet. But it was approaching. I didn't know it then, but the clock had already started counting down long before I noticed the sound. The realization didn't arrive all at once. It came in fragments. Small moments where I noticed that, later, was no longer behaving the way it used to. Conversations I assumed I'd have someday became awkward when I finally tried to start them. Opportunities one thought were waiting had quietly moved on. People I believed would always be there began living lives that no longer had room for my hesitation. Time hadn't turned against me. It had simply stopped waiting. That was the moment fear entered my life, not as panic, but as awareness. A steady, unsettling awareness that certain windows don't close loudly. They fade. They become irrelevant. And by the time you notice, you're no longer standing in front of them. I started to feel late. Not old. Not exhausted. Late. Late to saying things that mattered. Late to becoming honest about what wasn't working. Late to taking risks that once would have changed everything. I realized how often I had postponed truth because it felt inconvenient. How many times I had chosen silence because confrontation could wait. How often I had stayed in emotional neutral just because it allowed the day to pass without friction. Each choice seemed harmless. Together, they formed a pattern. I wasn't living toward anything. I was deferring myself. The pressure intensified when I noticed how differently I experienced memory. The past didn't feel full, it felt thin. There were long stretches of time I could barely distinguish from each other. Nothing terrible had happened. But nothing decisive had either. I had been present for my life without participating in it. That realization was harder to process than any obvious failure would have been. Failure gives you a story. It gives you a moment you can point to and say that's where things changed. I had no such moment. Just accumulation. The fear wasn't about death. It was about irrelevance. About reaching the end of my life and realizing I had been a careful observer of my own existence. That I had protected myself from regret so thoroughly that I had also protected myself from meaning. I began to understand something unsettling. Time doesn't punish hesitation immediately. It rewards it. At first. It makes waiting comfortable. It allows you to believe you're being wise. It gives you enough stability to continue delaying without consequences. And then, quietly, it removes your leverage. One day, you realize you're no longer choosing between options. You're choosing between what remains. That thought stayed with me constantly. It followed me through ordinary days, turning routine moments heavy. I looked at my habits and saw how much of my life was built around maintenance instead of direction. I wasn't moving toward anything that demanded urgency. Everything could be postponed. And that was the problem. I tried to shake the feeling by making plans. Long-term plans. Sensible plans. The kind that look productive on paper. But even as I wrote them, they felt detached, like outlines for a life that didn't quite belong to me. I could feel a truth pressing against my defenses. Later was no longer a promise. It was an excuse that had expired. I started noticing how often I said, "There's still time," without actually knowing if that was true. I said it reflexively, the way you repeat something comforting when you don't want to examine it too closely. But the comfort was fading. Because time was no longer abstract. It was visible. I could see it in the way my energy shifted. In the way certain chances no longer appeared. In the way my tolerance for emptiness shrank. The illusion of infinite opportunity had cracked, and through that crack, urgency seeped in. Not loud urgency. Quiet urgency. The kind that doesn't shout but doesn't let you sleep either. I understood then that I had crossed a line without noticing. A line where waiting was no longer neutral. Where postponement had become a decision with consequences. I wasn't facing the loss of time in the future. I was facing the realization that I had already spent most of it assuming there would be more. And that realization led me to a question I could no longer avoid. If later is no longer guaranteed, what do I do now? The moment I finally understood that I didn't have more time wasn't dramatic. It was quiet. Embarrassingly ordinary. I was doing something routine, something I had done hundreds of times before, when the thought landed fully formed, without panic or emotion. This is my life right now. Not a draft. Not a pause. Not a waiting room. This. And for the first time, I couldn't tell myself I'd fix it later. Because later had stopped feeling real. I felt a wave of grief that surprised me with its calmness. Not for a specific mistake, not for a single missed chance, but for the way I had treated time as if it belonged to me in excess. As if it were a resource I could borrow against indefinitely. I realized how many moments I had lived half awake. How often I had chosen to postpone discomfort instead of facing it. How many versions of myself I had quietly assumed I could become, one day, without ever committing to being them now. I wasn't reckless with time. I was casual with it. And casualness is dangerous when it comes to things that don't renew. The panic I expected never came. What came instead was responsibility. A sober understanding that if I wanted my life to feel different, it wouldn't happen gradually or automatically. Time would not do the work for me. It never had. I had to decide how to live inside the limits that were already there. That realization didn't turn me into a different person overnight. I didn't suddenly become bold or fearless. But something fundamental shifted. I stopped assuming there would be another chance to say what mattered. Another opportunity to choose differently. Another moment to become honest. I began treating the present as the only place where life could actually occur. That changed everything. Conversations became sharper. Not harsher, clearer. I said things when they mattered instead of when they were safe. I made choices knowing they might not be perfect, but also knowing they were real. I let go of the fantasy that I would one day feel ready. Ready had always been a lie I told myself to avoid acting inside uncertainty. I learned something uncomfortable but freeing. Time doesn't ask you to be ready. It asks you to be present. Presence didn't make life easier. It made it heavier. Every choice carried weight now. Every day counted in a way it never had before. I could no longer hide behind the comfort of postponement. I felt regret more sharply, but also joy more honestly. Even ordinary moments stopped feeling disposable. Because I knew they wouldn't come back. I grieved the years I had spent assuming I had more time. Not with bitterness, with clarity. I couldn't reclaim them. But I could stop sacrificing the time I still had to the same illusion. That was the real second chance. Not starting over. Starting now. If you're listening to this and you recognize yourself, living carefully, postponing what matters, telling yourself you'll do it when things slow down, hear this without fear. There is no stockpile of time waiting for you. There is only the moment you're in. And the moment you're in is already asking something of you. I lived like I had more time. When I finally understood that I didn't collapse. I woke up. Not to urgency that panics, but to urgency that clarifies. I don't rush now. I choose. I don't live as if tomorrow is guaranteed. I live as if today counts. Because it does. And it always did, I just didn't notice until time stopped pretending it would wait for me.